So it's my pleasure to introduce the first fellow speaker. This is Paulina Rodriguez. Paulina comes to us from George Washington University, where she was studying mechanical engineering. Her advisor was Lorena Barba. And Paulina completed two practicums, both at Sandia National Lab and Labs in New Mexico. Paulina.
Okay, so hear me okay. So today I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about my dissertation research and looking at the credibility of computational models with a focus on medical device applications. So the medical device space is starting to use a lot more computational models to help inform the development of medical devices, the testing, and even the manufacturing of them. We're starting to see more computational models being used to support patient care, and we're even starting to see things such as digital twins, which we'll hear more about from Dr. Amanda Randall tomorrow, our keynote. But what we are not really seeing in the space of computational modeling for medical devices is the use of these models as a primary source of evidence to inform high-risk applications. And so that's something that I've been trying to tackle for my dissertation research, which is looking at how do we establish and build trustworthiness in computational models. So I'm going to focus on these 4 pillars. So for verification, we did hear a little bit about kind of code correctness earlier from Ariel in her presentation. But the goal here is really for the physics-based models that I'm looking at to focus on correctness of the code and understanding any of the errors associated with discretizing these types of problems. Next, we have validation, which is looking at grounding these comparisons in the physical world. So even though these theoretical models are correct, we need to make sure that they are representative of the physical world. This can be by comparing against laboratory experiments, and it could be a deterministic or probabilistic comparison. Next, we have uncertainty quantification, and this is trying to capture all the unknowns we know about the system and including them into our computational model. So this can be by propagating input uncertainties and understanding any errors associated with your models. And then lastly, this one's not typically included in kind of trustworthiness, but I want to include reproducibility. We want to be able to rely on the models, rely on the analysis so that we can trust the predictions from these systems. We do this for experiments, we should be able to try to translate that over to computational models. For my study, I wanted to look at a very simple medical device system that looks at fluid flow and heat transfer so that I can illustrate this entire process and workflow. I'm not going to go through all of that for this presentation because it's fairly long, but I'm going to focus on some of it. So this system takes in fluid, heats it up, and then it exits and enters a user's mouth. So here I have some CFD and heat transfer simulations just showing you the velocity and temperature profiles of the system. As you can see here, we have an open air boundary condition, which is to illustrate that we're already simplifying the type of systems we're looking at. This is not the exact medical device, but we're starting to already simplify what we're looking at. Additionally, I mentioned we want to ground this on something that's comparable to the physical world, so we're going to be comparing to some experimental data. Again, this is going to introduce new limitations, new assumptions, but we want to be able to capture these types of assessments. Keeping in mind that conducting experiments also introduces additional complications. In the medical device space, having medical data is typically difficult, so relying heavily on a computational model would be significantly useful. So what I'm proposing is that we need to make sure that we have some form of rigorous verification so that we can trust our model before we start to introduce all these additional complexities and uncertainties. So for this analysis I'm going to share with you all, it's going to be looking at the verification component. So I've further simplified the system to only look at the device. So we're going to conduct a spatial and temporal resolution study. And then we're also going to try to compare against some analytic solutions since we have a fairly simplified system. So for code verification, I wanted to try and isolate this problem into a fluid flow and then like a heat transfer problem. For the fluid flow region, we pretty much just have pipe flow. So we have, in this case, twice the hydrodynamic entry length, so we can ensure fully developed flow regime. And for our heat source problem, we are starting off with a fully developed flow, and then we can look at the thermal development. So we also conducted a mesh resolution study. So here I just wanted to highlight, as we discretize our problem, We end up having some pretty sparse meshes to start with, but we want to be able to capture finer mesh resolutions to have better, more accurate results. But being able to kind of characterize this entire process is necessary. So here for the fluid flow problem, we were able to compare against an analytic solution. So we have the Hagen-Fussell flow problem, which gives us our radial velocity pointwise. We're able to calculate an L2 norm, and we're able to attain a reasonable observed order of convergence, and the order of magnitude for our errors, which is what we're interested in, is about 10 to the negative 3. For our heated fluid flow problem, we were also looking for an analytic solution to compare against. Unfortunately, everything we found required extreme simplification that took us too far away from the geometry we're looking at for our device. In this case, we looked at a streak extrapolation, which was a stochastic approach to calculate a converged value based on our mesh resolution. And so again, here we were able to see an observed order of convergence that was reasonable and a fairly small error. Next, for solution verification, we wanted to characterize the spatial and temporal contributions to the error. In this case, we're looking at something that's closer to the full medical device. So we have the full dimensions matching up to the device. Actually, they're backwards here, but what we want to characterize is we want to be able to further understand the system and get closer and closer to our validation model. So in this case, we ended up looking at 3 different cases. The first case looked to a spatial discretization where we fixed the time step, and we looked at 7 different mesh resolutions, and we try to characterize the observed order of convergence and the error. For the temporal discretization, conversely, we varied the time step and fixed the mesh resolution. And so here we saw that we had some fairly reasonable, okay observed order of convergence, and our relative errors were fairly small. We were also able to determine that the spatial discretization contributed the largest errors to our predictions. But we went further and looked at both the mesh and temporal discretization, and we wanted to see how they performed if we refined both of them consistently. And here we were able to see that we attained the observed order of convergence that we expected, and our relative errors were fairly small. So now I wanted to go look into this a little bit deeper. So for this study, I wanted to kind of compare everything. So we have both the mesh, temporal resolution, and the combined study. And the goal here is to calculate our errors and to determine the best model for us to use. And so in this case, we don't see anything new. The finer meshes, the smaller time steps gave us the best errors. Unfortunately, when we're running simulations, we have to consider factors such as computational cost. All of the simulations I ran here, I ran in parallel on a solo collaborative cluster at Sandia National Labs. And so I wanted to characterize the cost. So we want to be able to choose an error, but we want to be able to choose a reasonable error within the constraints of this computational cost. So in this case, our D&E points, which were giving us the smallest errors, actually took a very long time to run. But that kind of middle in the road C point gave us a reasonable error and a pretty quick runtime. I did want to highlight that because we're looking at an implicit solver, point B highlights something fairly interesting. We do have an error that's fairly large, and it took a really long time to run. And that is because we're taking a lot more iterations to solve because we don't have a fairly good mesh and temporal resolution. So this also highlighted the fact that choosing the right combination with a reasonable error and computational cost is essential. Okay, and then next, I want to talk a little bit about reproducibility. So I mentioned that it's important that we trust our results. So as I've been working on this study, I realized that reproducibility, gold standard, is really to reattain all of our studies and analysis. But in practice, we're actually working on this in a very modular way. You want to be able to reproduce your model on its own, reproduce your credibility studies, and any other component. So here I've been working in a modular kind of format. As I develop my model, I'm able to share my input conditions, my meshes, and then I've been able to kind of go through this entire cycle in components. It gives you a chance to kind of plug and play. Maybe somebody doesn't want to reproduce an entire model, but they want to conduct their own credibility analysis. And so this gives us a way to have kind of a better model and analysis. And I have some time. I just wanted to share my summer practicums. Because my work is extremely interdisciplinary, and I've been working on a project that brings together ideas from BVUQ and other areas and applying it to the medical device space, I wanted to really highlight that working at the Sandia National Labs and getting hands-on experience working on their clusters in real time managing job submissions, getting things to work the way other Sandians work, really gave me access and experience to something that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And that is really where I learned the most, where I applied most of the information from my program of studies, hands-on. I also had access to a really good team of EVUQ experts where I learned a lot of the techniques for their kind of high-risk applications and translated some of those methodologies over for the medical device space. Additionally, it was a truly collaborative space. I had the opportunity to work with my mentor and to do pair programming with them, to work on some of my analysis, some of my job submissions, for the projects I worked on with them and for my dissertation research. So I had a really good opportunity to do all of these things. And also, I really fell in love with Albuquerque. They're a really good place, and I would really recommend it for anybody who wants to do a practicum. That's it. I just wanted to thank everybody who's helped me so far.